Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to our events entitled Test Your Mind, How Environmental Factors Can Influence Brain Function and Cognitive Abilities. Our initiative comprises 4 different activities, a video of 10 minutes summarizing what we are saying also in this conference will be projected on a screen installed in the main hall with few chairs and headphones so you can sit and watch it. Conference, that is what we are doing now for around 1 hour and a half. Speed date that will take place here from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. At the end, games from 3:30 to 6 p.m. in a class near here to the amphitheatrum. So let me better explain how the different activity will work. So first conference, the presentation will last around 1 hour and 30 minutes, and the whole presentation is organized in 4 parts. So I will briefly introduce you to some general concept about brain, its evolution, its function, physiology, and what can happen when its physiology is perturbed. After, Dr. Paola Brivio will present you the evidence of cognitive deficit in psychiatry disorder, and Dr. Scheggia will discuss the issue of this kind of dysfunction in the field of neurodegenerative diseases. And at the end, Dr. San Giovanni will provide scientific evidence supporting the role of natural product in the activity of the central nervous system. At the end of the whole presentation, your question will be more than welcome. So please feel free to ask. After the presentation, we will have a brief break and then the speed dating here in this room. All the speakers will be available to discuss with you face-to-face about your doubts, your question, and your curiosity. So please do not be shy and ask. Finally, from 3:30, we can play together with some easy and funny games to test our cognitive performance. Both children and older people will be more than welcome. So it's now time to move to the more serious and scientific part. So my name is Francesca Calabrese, and I am an associate professor in pharmacology at the Department of Pharmacological and Biomolecular Science at the University of Milano. And if I will probably appear not very young but not very old, my brain is put in real stress by having 2 girls at home. So it often happens that my cognitive performance is not at its best. So the first question we have to answer is, what type of organism have brain? So the answer is easy, is animal. Animals have nerves, muscle to move, and they have to organize this movement. And to do it, they use brain. So simple animals, as starfish, have a central nervous system radially symmetrical. So each arm of the starfish has a radial nerve which is linked to a central neural net. The planaria has developed eye spots to help sense their environment. These eye spots connect to a central communication center that we can call brain. More complex animals have a nervous system bilateral symmetrical, such as, for example, tiger. So you can draw a line right down the middle, and you can identify a right side and a left side. And there is also a clear front and hand. As we said, the central nervous system is needed to organize movement. So a simple example of how this happens. So this animal is going to move toward the right, and as it does so, it has to take information that is called sensory information using neurons. And this is similar to what we are doing now. So you are taking in information using neuron from your eyes, from your ears, and then inside your brain, you are going to integrate the information. You are going to make sense of it, and then you are going to figure out what you want to do, how you are going to act, and so then we have this loop of motor neurons out. Starting from this primitive, this kind of very primitive organism, we can also understand how the brain works. They have a real common structure with 4 parts. The first one in orange is the spinal cord, then 3 arms, the hindbrain in green, the midbrain in blue, and the forebrain in red. What is very interesting is that we can find this structure consistently through all animals. And if we look at the brain of an animal like a shark, it pretty much looks just like that primitive brain. Indeed, down here, we have the spinal cord that brings information in. We have the hindbrain in green, the midbrain in blue, and the forebrain in red. So what you can remember is that closer to the spinal cord the brain region is, more basic the function are. Such, for example, the hindbrain keeps the heart beating, the circulation going. But when the shark decides to attack, or he has a kind of emotional response, so these functions are controlled by the forebrain. Surprising, or maybe not, if you look at a human being in its first stage of development, so an embryo, the brain structure is very similar. There is the spinal cord in yellow, the hindbrain in green, the midbrain in blue, and the forebrain in red. So as the human being grows, the brain develops and this structure changes dramatically. Indeed, the adult brain looks like this, but still we can recognize all the previous regions. So the spinal cord, the hindbrain in green, the midbrain, and the forebrain that is become the larger portion of the brain. So the anatomy of the human brain is very complex. So only to mention some structure, we have medulla oblongata and pons. We have the cerebellum in the back, hypothalamus, thalamus, and finally we have the cerebrum, that is the dominant upper portion of the brain. Let's see the function and the region associated. So we previously mentioned pons and medulla oblongata, that together with the midbrain are called brainstem. And this structure controls basic needs such as heart rate and breathing. So any damage to the brainstem leads to catastrophic consequences. Moreover, here we have the sensory information coming up to the brain, and then we have the motor nerves coming out. So this region is important in directing and filtering the information. On the back, we have the cerebellum, and its function is motor control, but also motor memory. So if you learn to ride a bicycle and do you remember how to do this, it's thanks to the cerebellum. And as we said, we have then the cerebrum. Its mainly function is integration, so making sense of all the data that's come in. And this is done thanks to neuron and synapses, but we will speak about that soon. Actually, the 80% of the brain is represented by the cerebral cortex that can be divided in 4 lobes: frontal lobes, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. In the front, we have the frontal lobe that mostly control executive function. So is in such a way the boss of your brain, but also emotional control. As consequences, people who have damage of the frontal lobe have really huge emotional swings. Moving toward the back, we have the parietal lobe, and its function basically is sensation, so the sense of touching and sensing and tasting. The primary function of the occipital lobe is vision. And moving on the side, we have the temporal lobe that is very important in memory processes. Another very curious and interesting thing that for sure increases the hunger of knowledge about the complexity of our brain is the concept of brain lateralization. So as all of us know, the human brain is split into two hemispheres, so the right and the left. They are both joined together by the corpus callosum, a bundle of nerve fibers which is located in the middle of the brain. Actually, the hemispheric lateralization is the idea that each hemisphere is responsible for different function. Each of these functions is localized either to the right or left side. So we can say that the left hemisphere is associated with a more linear thinking mode, so the control of the right hand, and function like writing, scientific skill, mathematics, list logistic, and it contains also different language centers like the Broca and the Wernicke's area, while the right hemisphere is more associated with an holistic thinking mode, control the left hand, and is associated with emotional expression, spatial awareness, creativity, imagination, and dimension. And this is what happens mainly in the majority of people, especially those who are right-handed. As mentioned before, the fundamental players of our brain are neurons, even if we know that other important cell types are present, and synapses. So in a very simple way, when we said that the brain is integrating information, we basically mean that neurons are activated and synapses communicate one to each other. Briefly, neurons are composed of three main parts, so soma, dendrites, and axon. At the end of the axon, we have synapses that allow communication between neurons. So the synapses of one neuron creates a contact with the axon, the soma, or the dendrite of another neuron, and so on, thus allowing the formation of a very complex network. Each synapse is mainly formed by three parts. The axon terminal, also named synapse, the postsynapse that, as we said, may be located on a dendrite or the soma or on the axon. The synaptic cleft, that is the space between the two previous components. So what happens is that the neurotransmitters, that is the messenger bringing the information, has been synthesized and stored into the vesicles in the presynapses. When the stimulus arrives, the neurotransmitter is released in the synaptic cleft and binds the receptor on the postsynapses, leading to the propagation of the signal. So accordingly, it has been suggested that it is not the size alone that gives more brain power, but that during the evolution, increasingly sophisticating molecular processing allow the development of animals with more complex behavior. So to cite Professor Seth Grant of the Sanger Institute, the molecular evolution of the synapses is like the evolution of the computer chips. So the increasing complexity has given them more power, and those animals with the most powerful chips can do the most. So this means that the complexity of the synapses is strongly correlated with the ability of the species, and so simple invertebrated species have a set of simple forms of learning powered by a molecularly simple synapses, and the complex mammalian species show a wider range of types of learning powered by a molecularly very complex synapses. So based on what we have seen so far, it's not surprising that alteration in the brain function, brain activity, functionality, and anatomy leads to the development of different pathology. And we can classify the pathology affecting the brain in four big categories. So brain tumors, neurological disease such as epilepsy, psychiatry disease such as schizophrenia and depression, and neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson. So as you will heard in the next presentation, all these pathologies are characterized by physical and emotional symptoms that may be similar, but also very different depending on the pathology that we are considering. While we can say that the category of symptoms that is commonly found in all the pathology affecting the brain is the cognitive deficit. And we will better understand these issues by listening to my colleagues. But what we mean by saying cognitive function? Actually, we are speaking about a wide range of function. For example, executive function, that are the abilities in our brain that help us complete everyday tasks. So these skills include planning, organization, time management, metacognition, working memory, self-control, attention, flexibility, and perseverance. Sometimes it's helpful to think of executive function like an air traffic controller in our brain. So the executive function center is assigning tasks to each of the different skills. For example, it tells us to focus on really listening while someone is talking, so attention, while reminding us to get started when we have an assignment due to the end of class, so task initiation. All of these skills work together to make sure we are working efficiently and effectively while completing daily tasks. We have also social cognition, is the way in which people process, remember, and use information in social context to explain and predict their own behavior and that of others. And visual spatial function refer to cognitive processes necessary to identify, integrate, and analyze space and visual form, details, structure, and spatial relation in more than one dimension. So visual spatial skills are needed for movement, depth and distance perception, and spatial navigation. Impaired visual spatial skill can result in, for example, poor driving ability because distances are not judged correctly or difficulty navigating in space, such as bumping into things. So what I can anticipate is that cognitive decline interferes with everyday living, both at work but also with family and friends relationship. In other words, with psychosocial functioning, academic performance, and workplace productivity. A destra.
So good afternoon to everyone. In the following 20 minutes, I will talk you about how cognitive deficit appears in psychiatric disorders. I am Paola Brivio. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Pharmacological and Biomolecular Sciences of the University of Milan, and I'm currently working in the Laboratory of Experimental Psychopharmacology. Psychiatric disorders are an umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of disorders, including depression, bipolar disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, autism spectrum disorders, anxiety, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's important to say that the burden of mental disorders continues to grow up with significant impact not only on health but also on social human rights and economic consequences in all the world is increasing. And indeed, as mentioned by Francesca, this pathology can affect a person's thinking, perception, mood, and behavior. And the mental illness can make it difficult for someone to cope with work, relationship, or other demands. Depression is one of the main causes of disability worldwide. It affects 280 million people in the world. That is around the 5% of adults within all the world. The pathology, the etiology of the pathology is still unknown, even if it's known that different environmental and genetic factors contribute each other to lead to the development of the pathology. Depression is characterized by several and different symptoms, including lack of energy, feeling sad, thoughts of death, apathy, guilt, lack of appetite, loss of interest in activities, and cognitive deficit. And we can say that mainly cognitive deficit cause difficulty in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, and all other important areas of functioning. So they interfere with our everyday living. Schizophrenia could be defined as second psychiatric disorder mainly diffused in the world, and it affects 20 million people. The symptoms that are characteristic of a schizophrenia patient are quite different from the ones we found in the depressed patient, and they include delirium, distortion in thinking, hallucinations, delusions, apathy, disorganized speech, and distortion in emotion, and of course, cognitive deficit. And all these symptoms, characteristic of a schizophrenic patient, cause considerable disability, and this disability may affect educational and occupational performance. And to date, studies on psychiatric disorders has mainly focused their attention on the main symptoms of all these pathologies, for example, depressed mood, anxiety, or hallucination, whereas lower studies focus their attention on cognitive deficit, that actually can be described as a transdiagnostic domain among all the psychiatric disorders I have mentioned, starting from depression and schizophrenia to anxiety-like behavior, autism spectrum disorder, bipolar disorder, PTSD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as in patients with obsessive compulsive disorders. But we can say that cognitive dysfunction does not signify poor memory, but we will see in the next slide that the range of cognitive impairment is broader and more complex. Actually, cognitive function is based on universal and higher domains. The universal domains are working memory, executive functions, attention, procedural learning and memory, speed of processing, fear extinction learning, and semantic memory. Whereas we have higher domain that are more sophisticated domain, that includes episodic memory, language, social cognition, the theory of mind, and verbal learning and memory. And as we can see from this table, I adapted from the review of Milan and colleague, we can see that the different domains I have mentioned to you are differently affected in the several psychiatric disorders. If we look at patients with a major depressive disorder, we can see that mostly of these domains are affected in a moderate way. For example, they have alteration in a mild way for attention and vigilance, working memory, executive function, episodic memory, as well as for processing speed, whereas the other domains are less altered. On the contrary, if sorry. I don't know how to go on. If you look, for example, at schizophrenia, we can see that most of these domains are affected in a higher way. For example, we can see different plus, for example, 3 plus for all these domains. And, okay, sorry. And whereas less of these domains are affected, for example, semantic memory or procedural learning. Whereas if we look at the panic disorder pathology, we see that most of these domains are not affected, whereas this patient has a great impairment only in the domain that regulate attention and or vigilance. And the fact that multiple domains are usually affected in the different psychiatric disorders complicates the task of discovering effective and novel pharmacological treatments for cognitive deficit. But which are the factors that contribute to the development of cognitive deficit? We can say that disruption of cognition is provoked by an interaction of genetic, environmental, epigenetic, and developmental factors. And these factors alone or interacting each other may contribute to cognitive dysfunction, also depending on the period of life we are exposed to these negative factors. And everyday life, we are exposed to different environmental factors, and in particular, depending on their nature, they can compromise cognitive function through life. In particular, the most important negative factors that are responsible for cognitive deficit in psychiatric disorders are abuse, the socioeconomic status, stress exposure, the abuse of substances, and the sociocultural status, as well as traumatic events. And despite the high relevance of the disability caused by cognitive dysfunction in our life, the pharmacological treatments available to date to treat these symptoms are still inadequate because they indirectly modulate cognitive deficit. To date, the classical drugs used to treat cognitive dysfunction are antidepressants, the second-generation antipsychotic, as well as cognitive enhancer. But they've been developed to treat the major symptoms of psychiatric disorder rather than modulate cognitive deficit. So we can say that these drugs modulate cognitive dysfunction, but indirectly. Actually, there are some problems related with these pharmacological treatments. First, the treatment response rate is around 50%, and despite the successful treatment and the achievement of remission, in many patients, memory biases still persist. Moreover, as I mentioned, cognitive deficits are insufficiently targeted within the current therapeutic framework. So we can say that the novel pharmacological treatment to enhance cognitive function in a patient with psychiatric disorder should target specific domains that are altered in the several psychiatric conditions. So in this way, we could obtain a direct modulation of cognitive dysfunction. Actually, this is an unmet need, the fact that pharmacological treatments are not able to modulate these negative symptoms associated with psychiatric condition. And the pharmacotherapy should target both the emotional and cognitive impairments by modeling the genetic, developmental, and in particular the environmental factors. And it's also important to say that the successful development depends on the careful translation of information acquired in animal and cellular models into the clinical research. Moreover, it is important to say that clinicians use also some non-pharmacological approaches in combination with the classical pharmacological treatments for psychiatric disorders to enhance cognitive function. And these non-pharmacological approaches include non-invasive brain stimulation, direct current stimulation, physical exercise, as well as psychosocial treatments. And all these non-pharmacological approaches could have a positive impact on cognitive function through the modulation of neuroplastic mechanism within the brain, and in particular within specific brain regions that have been linked with the modulation of memory and learning function, such as, for example, the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex. So to conclude this part, I would say to all of you that we need to challenge our brain to increase and enhance our cognitive performance in everyday life. And to do so, all of us should conduct healthy lifestyles, should reduce the exposure to chronic stress events, should spend time with person, friends, and family, and perform physical exercise to improve our performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you, everybody, for attending to this talk. So I'm gonna focus on cognitive and behavioral dysfunction in neurodegenerative diseases. I'm Diego Scheggia from the same Department of Pharmacological and Biomolecular Sciences of the University of Milan. And in particular, we'll focus on neurodegenerative diseases, which is a range of conditions affecting neurons that you have understood are the building blocks of our brains, causing degeneration and death. And since neurons can't replicate, they can't be replaced. So once they're damaged, we lose our neurons. There are a range of neurodegenerative diseases, starting from dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's diseases, Huntington disease, but there are many others I didn't list in here. But what is important to know is that the neurodegeneration mainly provoke two kinds of symptoms. First of all, deficits in mental functioning, such as in the case of dementia, mostly happening in Alzheimer's disease, for example, and deficits in movement, which is called ataxia, which is happening in Parkinson's disease. But actually, all these kind of deficits may happen in all the neurodegenerative diseases. Dementias are responsible for the greatest burden of neurodegenerative diseases. But in particular, Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, accounting approximately almost to 60 to 70% of the cases of dementia, with in particular showing severe memory loss and other cognitive abilities impaired that we'll see in a moment. As you can see from this slide, by 2050 there will be a huge increase in the number of cases of subjects affected by Alzheimer's disease. In Europe, this increase will be, of course, this is just an estimation, but it will be about 90%, and in other countries it will be even higher. What is important to know is that even though the number of the cases of subjects with dementia is smaller compared to other conditions, such as psychiatric diseases, such as mood disorder, anxiety disorder, addiction, the costs associated with the management of dementia are amongst the highest, meaning that dementia is not only a healthcare problem, but also a socio-economical one. Here you can see all the stages of the diseases, starting from severe memory loss. This is, let's say, the most common cognitive symptoms happening at the beginning, at the onset of dementia, as well as Alzheimer's disease. And together with the progressive cognitive decline, with the decline of the cognitive states, other symptoms appear over the time, starting from loss of self-sufficiency, other behavioral symptoms, until the need for hospitalization and death. This is an example of an interview form that is delivered to patients with Alzheimer's disease, which is called mini mental state exam. Is let's say, a cognitive assessment to understand the cognitive state of the patient, which is usually done together with brain scans that you can see, for example, in this picture. And as you might already know, dementia is usually accompanied by progressive atrophy of the brain as the neurodegeneration progresses over time. So there is this shrinkage of the brain that follows the cognitive decline. And in this form, usually subjects affected by dementia are asked about their ability in the orientation. So they're asked about what is the day, where they do think they are, and then they are assessed for memory functioning, and also language skill, reasoning skills, and also they are assessed for the level of consciousness. So together, along with the brain shrinkage, so with the brain atrophy and the progressive loss of neurons, as said already, the first symptom is the memory loss. But then over time, other behavioral symptoms appear. These are called behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia that include anxiety, in general mood changes, maybe aggression sometimes, and also another hallmark feature of dementia is the disorientation. So subjects affected by Alzheimer's disease and by other dementia, they can suffer from confusion about time, about places, and so they may wander around and get lost sometime. Then over time, so they also may encounter deficit in face recognition of family, even family members, caregivers, and all these deficits also may affect the proper decision making, affecting, of course, their functioning in everyday life. At the end of, let's say, later stages, also motor skills may be affected, and also semantic and language abilities. Here you can see two of the most prominent signs of dementia that we can observe in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. On the left, you see aggregation of amyloid beta that we know under the name of plaques. And on the right, the deposition of the tau protein that organize in neurofibrillary tangles. The tangles are located inside the cells, inside the neurons of our brains, while the plaques, they surround the neurons. And both plaques and tangles may affect the morphology of our brain, affecting the morphology of the neurons. Here, for example, you see a beautiful picture of a neuron on the left, that with all the arborization. It looks like almost a tree. And during dementia, as said, plaques and tangles may change the morphology of these neurons, affecting in particular the morphology of the dendritic spines, which are the sites of communication of the neurons. So all the effort so far that have been made in order to find a treatment for Alzheimer's diseases and other dementia focused mainly on the role of these plaques that surround the neurons, and they affect the morphology of our neurons and of our brain. To date, we don't have a treatment for dementia, and we don't have even any kind of treatment in order to modify the progression of the pathology. So mainly all the effort, as said, focused on strategies to modify the accumulation of beta plaques. But there are also other possible strategies, starting from preventive strategies, of course, taking into account other system different from the brain, including the metabolism or inflammation or the oxidative stress. While at the end, once the disease progresses, only symptomatic or palliative strategies are possible once the neuronal death is already happened. So far, a huge number of molecules have been tested, but as said, we don't have yet a treatment for dementia and for Alzheimer's disease. However, this year, one molecule has been approved by the FDA in US, which is named aducanumab, which is an anti-amyloid monoclonal antibody that attack and trying to reduce the accumulation of beta amyloid plaques. So to sum up, we saw that neurodegenerative diseases may happen only in elderly. This is false, actually, because we have two forms of Alzheimer's disease. For example, we have a sporadic form and a genetically related form, which is caused by specific genetic mutation that may lead to early onset dementia. If a family member has dementia, thus I will have dementia too. This is false, because even though we have the same mutation, this doesn't mean that for sure we'll have the same pathology. But for sure is that all the neurodegenerative diseases in general are lethal. Neurodegenerative diseases can be prevented. This is false. We can't prevent neurodegeneration, but if we look at the risk factors, so for example, for sure the biggest risk factor is the increasing age, and also the genes, genetic background. So as said, there are some form of Alzheimer's disease that are related to specific genetic mutations. However, there is another big component of the risk factor that may have an effect on the onset of the pathology. That is our lifestyle. If we look at these risk factors, the most prominent one is the physical inactivity. Physical inactivity has been shown to have a higher impact than other, for example, psychiatric conditions, or even more than obesity and diabetes, or even more than smoking. Indeed, if we make a review of all the literature about the impact of physical activity and dementia, so if we look at all the scientific articles taking into account the role of physical activity, we observe that physical activity may reduce up to almost 30% the risk to develop a form of dementia. And for example, this is a study that has been conducted over more than 5 years in older people, and it has been shown that older subjects with very low physical activity, they have higher risk to develop Alzheimer's disease compared to older subjects with high physical activity. So we can't prevent dementia and neurodegenerative diseases in general, but there are some strategies that we may implement by changing our behavior and taking account this risk factor. And with this, I leave the stage to my colleague, Enrico.
Thank you very much. So in the last part of this presentation, we will discuss about natural products and how these products could be useful, for example, to treat central nervous system pathologies, but also to enhance some of the physiological condition of the brain. But first, I will just introduce myself. My name is Enrico San Giovanni, and I work in the same department of my previous colleagues, that is the Department of Pharmacological and Biomolecular Sciences in Università degli Studi di Milano, Milan, and in particular, I work in the laboratory of pharmacognosy. Pharmacognosy is a field of research which investigates the role and the biological activities of plants or natural products in humans. So, in this part, before discuss the possible natural products useful for brain, it's important to introduce what is a natural product and why it's so important to also produce an efficacy and also rigorous natural product with strict rules. So, in this slide, you can see the medicinal plants. Medicinal plants is a group of natural products, so a small part of the whole vegetable population of the earth, which are plants that possess bioactive molecules in some of their organs. These bioactive molecules are important to produce a pharmacological effect in human. Often confused, there are also another group of plants that is named officinal plants, which is a broader group that also includes the medicinal plants, but also other plants that are used by humans to produce other effects, such, for example, plants useful for perfumes, but also aromatic plants for the organoleptic characteristic useful for culinary purposes, for example. So, when we talk about medicinal plants, it's also very important to introduce some concepts related to the pharmacognosy field. The first point is to introduce the name of active principles. Active principles are molecules, one or more molecules, that are included in a plant, in a specific species of a plant, which possess biological activities for humans. These could be useful for therapeutic approaches, and these active principles are usually concentrated in some parts of the plants, but this depends, and this is related to the species. Such, for example, if we look on the first image of Panax Ginseng, the roots are the part of the plants which includes the active principles that are used for the therapeutic effects. But different parts of a species, of different species, could be useful. In some cases, also the entire plant is the part of the plant that include the active principles. For this reason, when we talk about the specific region of a plant that is rich of active principles, we are speaking about drug. Drug is a term that in the pharmacognosy field identifies the part of the plant rich of active principle and used for the therapeutic purpose. The second and other important characteristic that we have to introduce is the term of phytocomplex. When we think about living organism, also plants are composed by cells, so vegetable cells. In this case, a plant could produce two different main, we can say, molecules. The first group is named primary molecules and is composed by very common and widely distributed molecules in the living organisms, such, for example, DNA, protein, which are fundamental for the life of an organism. But plants could also produce a second group of molecules that are named secondary active ingredients. These ingredients are molecules that are not fundamental for a plant, but they provide different other characteristics, such, for example, antibiotic defense, which could be used by the plants for defense or other advantages. In this case, when we think about a drug of a plant, for sure, we still need to keep in mind that this drug is made of different molecules and not by just one molecules purified. And this is one of the main differences when we compare, for example, a synthetic drug to natural products, which is a mixture of different molecules which not only could have different abilities in a drug, but these molecules could also interact one to each other to reinforce, for example, the biological activities, but also to reduce some of the side effects that sometimes are related to the pharmacological activities of a specific molecular target. So, talking about active principles in a plant, we should also keep in mind that plants are living organisms. So, the content of active principle in plants is dependent by different variables. One of the most important variables is for sure the genetic environment. So plants, as the animals, as humans, for example, have different genetic background even inside the same species. And this could produce a different amount or capability of a plant to produce active principles. For example, we could also think about the grape. So in grapes, there are different genetic variants which produce different wine with different organoleptic characteristics. And this is due to the genetic environment. But for a plant, there are also other variables that could influence the amount of active principles. And these are normally exogenous factors, such, for example, climatic characteristics, like the amount of light to which a plant is exposed, the temperature, the amount of water that the plant could absorb during the life cycle, but also other factors, such, for example, infections or the presence of insects that could interfere with the normal development of a plant. So all these factors produce a variability of the amount of the active principles. And this should always be kept in mind when we produce a natural product for a therapeutic use in humans. In fact, when we produce a product for a phytotherapeutic effect, one of the most important elements that influence the amount of active principle is the method of extraction. So here I bring an image of an infusion. We could also think about the production of a tea like a method of extraction, an example of method of extraction. In this case, we use fragmented pieces of leaves of Camellia sinensis, the plant of the tea, and we put these leaves in water, in this case, high temperature water. This is an extraction of molecules which are hydrophilic, so molecules that have an affinity to a water environment. This could be completely different, for example, if we modify the environment and we change water, for example, with oil. In this case, from the same leaves, we will extract a completely different amount of molecules that are completely different from the other ones. And this extraction, starting from the same material, produce a very different final product. So the extraction method is very fundamental. But after deciding which is the best extraction method, is also fundamental to identify which is the active principle of a plant and also to analyze and quantify this active principle in the final product. This is very important because I just described to you the different variables that could influence the amount of these molecules. So, after introducing these concepts, we will move on some example of plants that are used for treating different conditions of the brain or central nervous system, and that I grouped in 4 different categories in this part of presentation. So the first is anxiety problem, depression, cognitive decline, and also adaptogens, but also central nervous system stimulants. That are 2 different types of vegetable drugs that could be used to enhance our cognitive performance. So, in the first group, speaking about anxiety, the most famous plant that is widely distributed also in the market is for sure Valeriana officinalis, also named valerian. This plant has a wide and also long tradition of use. In this case, the drug of valerian is made by the roots which contains different molecules, such, for example, valerianic acids, which are the active principles of these plants. Valerian also includes other molecules in the phytocomplex, such, for example, valepotriates. These molecules are toxic for humans, but generally they are inactivated by our intestine, so they do not produce side effects in humans, but just in some in vitro tests made by some scientific studies. Valeriana officinalis is widely used as an anxiolytic drug, and in general, there are also some clinical studies that demonstrate this effect for humans. These scientific studies are not conclusive, so this plant could be used for humans, but its efficacy is not so well described because there are several clinical studies which provide different outcomes. So at the moment, we are not still sure about the real efficacy of this plant. For talking about side effects, luckily this plant has also minor side effects that in general include gastrointestinal disorders. Another plant that is studied for anxiety is Piper metisticum, also known as kava or kava. In this drug that is also prepared by the roots or the rhizome, so a more complex part that includes also roots, we have molecules that are named cavapyrons. This plant is very well studied. There are not a big amount, but a good amount of clinical studies that demonstrate a good efficacy in humans for the anxiolytic effect. And as also described by valerian, they act on the GABAergic system. The problem of Piper metisticum is the high toxicity for the liver. So cavapyrons are very active molecules, but they are also toxic for the liver. So when, for example, some products contain a high amount of cavapyrons, they could also induce liver damages, very important liver damages. So at the moment, this drug is not used anymore, especially in Europe. Another drug that is very useful for anxiety is Humulus Lupulus. And this drug is very famous also for the preparation of beer, because it contains some molecules, for example, alpha and beta acids, that are bitter acids that, for example, in the beer confer the particular taste, but also the antibacterial activity at this product. Humulus lupulus could be used also for the anxiolytic activities. In this case, compared also to the previous plants, we have some clinical studies that demonstrate that Humulus lupulus enhance the sleep, so it also produces an anxiolytic effect in humans, but the studies are still few, and so this plant is also under investigation at the moment. But luckily, also in this case, we have very few side effects reported. Talking about another important condition, that is depression, we first need to underline that natural products are used for depression, but when is mild or moderated, never in case of severe depression. In this case, the most famous plant is Hypericum perforatum, also known as St. John's wort. This plant possesses different molecules like hypericin and hyperforin. Especially the second one is the active principle that is contained in the flowering tops. That means the aerial part of the plants collecting during the flowering period. These molecules have a very well consolidated activities for depression. And also the European Medicinal Agency includes the use of this plant for the treatment of mild or moderate depression. One of the possible side effects of Hypericum perforatum is the skin photosynthesization. In this case, the accumulation of hypericins could induce a very sensible skin. In fact, people who are in treatment with Hypericum perforatum should avoid the contact with the sunlight, at least till the end of the treatment. Hypericum perforatum has also another important side effect because this drug interacts with a wide range of different active treatment. So, for example, is a person who is in treatment with Hypericum perforatum should avoid, for example, concomitant treatment with anticoagulant because these plants have produced a big group of interaction with different active principles. Another plant very consolidated for the use in the case of depression is Crocus sativus, also known as saffron. This plant is also used as culinary purposes. We should say that the drug is produced by the stigmas that are this part of the flower that is visible in this photo. But stigmas are also rare and very expensive. So, in general, studies and the use of saffron for depression is not well consolidated because it's very expensive to produce these drugs. But there are different clinical studies performed, for example, in Iran, where this plant is widely distributed, which demonstrate a good activity compared also to Hypericum perforatum in treating depression disorders. But in this case, we have also less side effects compared to Hypericum perforatum. When we talk about cognitive decline, we should always think about Ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo biloba is a very famous plant and also well known for the phytotherapeutic approaches that could be used by the help of this plant. In case of cognitive decline, we should also take in mind that the drug is made by the leaves, and leaves contain different molecules, but the active principles are ginkgolides and bilobalides. These molecules act and work in the brain not directly on neurons, but by enhancing and promoting the microcirculation of blood inside the brain. This enhancement could prevent some neurodegenerative effects that are the characteristic of some of the pathologies that were being well described by my previous colleagues. So ginkgo could be used especially for this effect on microcirculation. But unfortunately, despite the famous use of ginkgo, the clinical studies nowadays are very inconclusive, especially in case of cognitive decline. So we still need more investigation to understand if ginkgo is capable to induce or improve our cognitive performance. Talking about central nervous system stimulants, we should always focus on caffeine, that is the methylxanthine most famous and most used in our natural products. And this molecule is not present only in coffee, so in the seeds of coffee arabica, but is also present in other plants, such, for example, mate, guarana, that are also included in some of natural products used for phytotherapeutic approaches. Methylxanthines are also present in chocolate, such, for example, in the plant of Theobroma cacao. These molecules, we can see in this table, are distributed in final products in different amount. But if you look at the table of coffee, for example, on the first column of caffeine, you can see that caffeine is the most abundant methylxanthine present in different products, such, for example, tea, caffeine, but also coffee, sorry, and but also soft drinks. So these molecules have a different effect in our central nervous system, which includes the reduction of the activity of some receptors that are named adenosine receptors, and these effects induce an improvement in case of cognitive decline. There are some studies that demonstrate that caffeine could be useful to reduce the impact of this pathology, but also could enhance sport performances. But the collateral effect is that they reduce the amount of sleep. Talking about caffeine, we should also take in mind that we should avoid to intake a big amount of this molecule, avoiding at least less than 600 milligrams of caffeine per day. There are also some side effects of the use of this methylxanthines group that are related, for example, to the circulatory system, for the possibility to discover tachycardia or arrhythmias, but also other side effects like, for example, anxiety or neuromotor agitations. The last group of plants are adaptogens. These plants are used to induce resistance to stress. One of the most famous plants used for this purpose is Panax Ginseng. This plant is very famous and also known by its roots, which has a shape of a small human in the tradition, in the Chinese tradition. This ginseng is also important to underline that there are different plants that are known as ginseng in the market. So in this case, we are talking about Panax ginseng, that is also named Asiatic ginseng, that is different from American ginseng, that is Panax quinquefolius. In this case, the active principles are ginsenosides, and there are different studies that demonstrate the possible use of these molecules to reduce the symptom of fatigue. And another important aspect of ginseng is that it should be used for very short periods, because could also induce some side effects, especially for longer exposures. And the last plant which I show you in this presentation is Rhodiola rosea. Also in this case, this plant is well consolidated for like an adaptogens to reduce the stress. There are different clinical studies that demonstrate this effect in humans, and also in this case, the drug is made by the roots, which contained two important molecules that are named rosavine and salidroside. There are very few side effects, but also in this case, we still need other clinical studies to confirm the effect of these plants. So, to sum up the main concept of this part, we can say that natural product could be very useful to treat or enhance the performance of our brain in pathological or physiological condition. But we should always keep in mind that plants are living organisms with variables, and we should always be prepared to analyze their active principle and to study the best methodology to prepare these products. So, thank you.
So in conclusion, what we can say, what we have learned today, that cognitive decline is associated both with physiological processes like aging, but also with the pathological state. So in any case, we are master of our future, and we can try to slow down cognitive decline, but also increase and improve our cognitive abilities in every moment of our life. And so doing what? Dedicating ourselves every day to different activities, such as physical activity, reducing chronic stress, get enough sleep, healthy diet, mental stimulation, and social contact. And with this slide, we conclude our presentation. We want to thank all the agencies that allow this presentation, and also you for your attention. Ah sì, va bene, voglio sapere. Sì, maybe c'è un commento della tipa.
Yes.
Maybe alla fine poteva rispondere.
There's a comment in the chat. They say that Rhodiola and ginseng have always been very popular in the URSSR. In the URSS, yeah.
Yes. Commento. Yes, it's true. They are very popular, but the amount of studies, especially for Rhodiola rosea, are still not conclusive, in the sense that there are studies, but the results are always variables in the amount of efficacy of these plants. So there are studies where the plant is active in reducing fatigue. There are also studies where this effect is not present. So considering that clinical studies sometimes lack some important information about plants, such, for example, the method of extraction or the amount of active principle that is included in a product that is administered in a clinical studies, it's not possible to try very conclusive information about this plant when there are studies with this information lacking. So this is the reason why it's so difficult, even if there are different studies, to conclude an opinion about the efficacy of a specific plant. In this case, Rhodiola rosea, but also Panax Ginseng is also well studied. We have different mechanisms that are demonstrated in animal and also in vitro with cells. But when we move to clinical studies, we don't have this strong efficacy which can help us to demonstrate all the effect of these plants that is used in different fields, not always in the condition of fatigue, for example. So I hope to have answered.
Thank you.
I was actually wondering about the length of the treatment using drugs from plant.
There are different, so there is no unique answer to this question for sure. Some plants require a very long treatment to produce an effect, such, for example, valerian that we show in the previous slide, but also Hypericum perforatum, required at least 1 month of daily treatment to start to produce an effect. So people who takes, for example, valerian to treat anxiety and expect an immediate results, they would be just not happy to discover that they should take this drug for at least 1 month every day to start to have an effect. So it depends on the plant for sure. Some plants could not be used for a long time. Panax Ginseng, for example, should not be used over 2 weeks because it starts to induce another type of syndrome that is related to the too much excitatory effect that this plant could produce on the brain. So it's not easy, but for sure this information for these plants are well described, and people should always follow this information and not just think about treating themselves with the time frame that they prefer.
So if there are no more questions, I think we can close this session. Thank you very much for your attention.